David Rodriguez never imagined that giving away his only good winter coat on a bitter February morning would change everything. Standing at that bus stop, shivering in his thin sweater, he watched a stranger disappear into the gray dawn, wearing the jacket his late wife had bought him for their last anniversary together. 3 months later, his face appeared on every major news network as the centerpiece of an Oscar-nominated documentary about human kindness. What he thought was just helping someone in need had become the catalyst for a transformation that would touch thousands of lives. But first, David had to survive the worst winter of his life, with nothing but hope to keep him warm. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the darkness of David Rodriguez's cramped apartment at 4:06 a.m. The same merciless sound that had dragged him from sleep every weekday for the past 8 months. He rolled over in the narrow bed, his body aching from another 12-hour shift at the warehouse, and felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle into his bones like sediment in still water. Beside him, in the apartment's only bedroom, his 9-year-old son Michael slept peacefully, wrapped in every blanket they owned, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The heating had been shut off again. David had managed to scrape together enough for a partial payment to the utility company, but it wasn't enough to restore full service. They were living on borrowed time and borrowed warmth, rationing hot showers and cooking meals on the single electric burner that still worked in their makeshift kitchen. The apartment was a converted studio in one of Chicago's most neglected neighborhoods, where the rent was cheap enough for a single father working minimum wage, but where the walls were thin enough that every argument from neighboring units became part of their daily soundtrack. David pulled on his work clothes in the dark, the same faded jeans and worn flannel shirt he'd been rotating for weeks. His winter jacket hung on the back of the bedroom door, a heavy navy wool coat that his wife Carmen had given him 3 years ago for their 10th wedding anniversary. It was the nicest piece of clothing he owned, probably worth more than everything else in his closet combined, and it carried the faint scent of her perfume even now, 2 years after the cancer had taken her away. The jacket was his armor against the brutal Chicago winter, but more than that, it was his last tangible connection to the woman who had believed he could provide for their family, who had trusted him to keep their son safe and, quote, warm and fed. Every morning when he put it on, he felt Carmen's hands smoothing the collar, heard her voice telling him how handsome he looked, how proud she was to be his wife. It was a daily ritual of remembrance that kept him moving forward when everything else felt impossible. Michael stirred as David gathered his things, and for a moment David froze, hoping his son would stay asleep for another hour before the school alarm went off. The boy had been waking up earlier and earlier lately, complaining that the cold made it hard to sleep, and David knew that the thin walls and inadequate heating were taking their toll on his child's rest. Michael needed his sleep, needed his strength for school and soccer practice and all the normal activities that David was determined to preserve, despite their circumstances. The bus stop was 6 blocks away, a journey that took David through the heart of a neighborhood that the city seemed to have forgotten. Abandoned storefronts with soap-painted windows stood next to struggling bodegas and check-cashing places that charged predatory fees to people who had no other options. The streetlights were sporadic, many of them broken for months, and the sidewalks were cracked and uneven from years of neglect and harsh winters that came like clockwork every year. David had grown up in a different Chicago, in a working-class neighborhood where his father had supported a family of 5 on a factory wage, and his mother had stayed home to raise the children. That Chicago still existed in some places, but it felt increasingly distant from the reality he navigated every day. The factory jobs that had sustained his father's generation were gone, replaced by warehouse work and service industry positions that paid less and offered no security, no pension, no promise that hard work would eventually lead to something better. The morning air hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside, the wind whipping down the street with the kind of bitter intensity that Chicago winters were famous for. The temperature had dropped below zero overnight, and the weather forecast promised another week of the same brutal cold that had been gripping the city since January. David pulled his jacket tighter around his body and began the familiar walk to the bus stop, his breath forming clouds that disappeared almost immediately in the dry, cutting air. The bus route he took to work wound through several neighborhoods, each representing a different economic reality within the same sprawling city. He would pass through areas where the streetlights worked and the storefronts were occupied, where people emerged from warm houses to climb into reliable cars that started on the first try. Then the bus would turn down a different street, and suddenly the landscape would shift to boarded-up buildings and corner stores with bulletproof glass, where people waited for public transportation that was often late and always crowded. David's warehouse job was in an industrial district on the city's south side, a sprawling complex of distribution centers and shipping facilities that served the entire Midwest region. He had been working there since Carmen's medical bills had exhausted their savings and forced them to sell their small house in a better neighborhood. The job was physically demanding, requiring him to load and unload trucks for 10 to 12 hours a day. But it was steady work that paid just enough to cover rent and groceries if he was careful about every dollar. The bus stop where David waited every morning was a simple metal shelter with 3 glass walls that provided minimal protection from the wind. On good days, there might be 4 or 5 other commuters waiting for the 5:15 a.m. bus that would take them to various jobs across the south side. On cold mornings like this one, the shelter was usually empty, except for David and maybe 1 or 2 other people who had no choice but to brave the elements for the sake of a paycheck. As David approached the bus stop that February morning, he could see a figure already huddled in the corner of the shelter, someone he didn't recognize from his usual commute. As he got closer, he realized it was a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing what looked like expensive jeans and boots but no winter coat at all. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself, and she kept checking her phone with the desperate expression of someone who had been waiting far longer than expected. The woman looked lost, not just physically, but in a way that suggested she wasn't familiar with this part of the city, wasn't accustomed to waiting for public transportation in weather that could kill you if you weren't properly prepared. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose in the wind, and her face had the pale, pinched look of someone who was genuinely cold, not just uncomfortable. She was attractive, in an understated way, with intelligent eyes and the kind of posture that suggested confidence in other circumstances. But right now she looked small and vulnerable and completely out of her element. David's first instinct was to mind his own business, to wait quietly for the bus while maintaining the polite distance that urban life required. He had learned over the years that getting involved in other people's problems usually led to complications he couldn't afford, and his primary responsibility was to get to work on time so he could keep the job that paid for Michael's food and clothes and the roof over their heads. But as he watched the woman shiver in the inadequate shelter, something in his chest tightened with recognition. He had been cold like that before, genuinely cold in a way that went beyond discomfort into the realm of danger. He had been lost and unprepared and dependent on the kindness of strangers when Carmen was in the hospital and their world was falling apart around them. He remembered the feeling of being overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control, of needing help but not knowing how to ask for it, of being grateful for any small gesture that acknowledged his humanity. The woman noticed him watching and offered a weak smile, the kind of expression that was meant to convey that everything was fine when clearly everything was not fine at all. David could see that her lips were starting to turn blue, and he realized that she had probably been waiting at this bus stop for much longer than the 15 or 20 minutes that was normal for this route. She might have been out here for an hour or more, checking her phone and hoping for a ride that wasn't coming, slowly getting colder and more desperate as time passed. "Excuse me," David said, approaching her carefully so as not to seem threatening. "Are you okay? You look like you might be waiting for someone." The woman looked up at him with eyes that were bright with unshed tears, though whether from the cold or from frustration, David couldn't tell. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was shaky and her teeth were chattering. "My ride fell through, and I'm trying to figure out how to get downtown. The rideshare apps aren't working out here." David nodded, understanding immediately what had happened. This part of the city was effectively a dead zone for rideshare services, too far from the profitable downtown routes and too economically depressed to attract drivers who could afford to be selective about their passengers. The buses ran infrequently, and when they did come, they were often overcrowded and behind schedule. If you didn't know the system, if you weren't prepared for the reality of public transportation in an underserved neighborhood, You could find yourself stranded very quickly. The bus should be here in about 10 minutes, David said, glancing at his watch. It goes downtown, but it's going to be a long ride. Are you sure you're warm enough? The woman laughed, but it was a sound that contained no humor at all. I'm clearly not prepared for this weather, she admitted. I'm visiting from California, and I completely underestimated how cold it would be. My friend was supposed to pick me up, but her car wouldn't start. California. That explained the inadequate clothing and the surprise at Chicago's winter brutality. David looked at her more carefully, taking in the expensive boots and designer jeans, the smartphone in a case that probably cost more than he made in a week, the general air of someone who was accustomed to comfort and convenience, but had found herself suddenly thrust into a world where neither was guaranteed. The wind picked up, sending a gust of Arctic air through the bus shelter that made both of them recoil. The woman's shivering became more violent, and David could see that her hands were red and raw from the cold. She was in genuine distress, and if the bus was late, which happened frequently during extreme weather, she could be in real danger of frostbite or hypothermia. David looked down at his own jacket, feeling the weight of it around his shoulders, remembering Carmen's hands as she had helped him try it on in the department store 3 years ago. The jacket was warm and well-made, designed to withstand exactly the kind of weather they were experiencing. It was also the most valuable thing he owned, both financially and emotionally, his primary protection against a winter that had already been harsh and showed no signs of relenting. But the woman was shivering so hard that she could barely hold her phone steady, and her lips were definitely turning blue now. David had seen hypothermia before, during his brief stint in the army before Michael was born, and he recognized the signs. This wasn't just discomfort anymore. This was the beginning of a medical emergency, and she might not even realize how serious her situation was becoming. Here, David said, starting to unzip his jacket before he could think too hard about what he was doing. Take this. You need it more than I do right now. The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and something that might have been alarm. Oh no, I couldn't possibly, she said, but her protest lacked conviction. You'll freeze without it. I'll be fine, David said, which wasn't entirely true, but wasn't entirely false either. He would be cold, certainly. Colder than he wanted to be. But he was dressed in layers, and he knew how to manage discomfort. He had been doing it for months now, rationing heat and warmth and comfort, in ways that had become second nature. I work in a warehouse that's heated, and I'll be inside most of the day. You look like you might be outside more. He shrugged out of the jacket and held it out to her, trying not to think about Carmen's perfume or the memory of her hands smoothing the collar. The woman stared at it for a moment, and David could see her wrestling with her pride, with the awkwardness of accepting help from a stranger, with the practical reality that she genuinely needed what he was offering. Are you sure? She asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood the significance of the gesture, that this wasn't just a casual loan but something more meaningful. I'm sure, David said, and he was. Whatever happened next, whatever discomfort he might experience, he knew that Carmen would have approved of this choice. She had always been the one to offer help first, to see someone in need and respond without calculating the cost to herself. This was what she would have done, and doing it made him feel closer to her memory than he had in months. The woman took the jacket with hands that were shaking from more than just the cold. Thank you, she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. This is incredibly kind. I don't know how to repay you. You don't need to repay me, David said, wrapping his arms around himself as the wind cut through his flannel shirt. Just stay warm. She put on the jacket immediately, and David could see the relief flood her face as the warmth enveloped her. The coat was too big for her, designed for David's broader shoulders, but it covered her completely, and the color returned to her cheeks almost immediately. She looked up at him with an expression that was part gratitude and part bewilderment, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. What's your name? She asked. I want to remember who helped me today. David Rodriguez, he said. And you don't need to remember anything. Just get where you're going safely. I'm Claire, she said. Claire Davidson. And I will definitely remember this. The bus appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the gray morning darkness, and David felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that his commute could finally begin, that he would be out of the wind and on his way to work. Dread because the bus would be warm, and he would spend the entire 40-minute ride thinking about the jacket he was no longer wearing, feeling the absence of its protection and its memories. As the bus pulled up to the stop, Claire turned to him one more time. "I mean it," she said. "Thank you. This means more than you know." David nodded and stepped aside to let her board first, watching as she fumbled with unfamiliar bus fare and struggled to understand the payment system. He helped her figure out the card reader, guided her to a seat near the front where she would be safer and warmer, and then found his own place toward the back of the bus where he usually sat for the long ride to work. Throughout the journey, David found himself glancing toward the front of the bus where Claire sat wrapped in his jacket, staring out the window at the passing neighborhoods with the focused attention of someone who was seeing this part of the city for the first time. She occasionally took notes in a small notebook, writing quickly with hands that were finally steady now that they were warm. And David wondered what had brought her to this neighborhood, what had left her stranded at a bus stop in one of Chicago's most forgotten corners. When the bus reached downtown, Claire stood up and walked back to where David was sitting. "This is my stop," she said. "But I want you to know that I'll find a way to get your jacket back to you. Can I get your contact information?" David hesitated. He wanted the jacket back, certainly, but he also knew that arranging its return would be complicated. He didn't have a car to meet her, somewhere convenient, and he couldn't afford to take time off work for something that wasn't absolutely necessary. The jacket was important to him, but it was also just a jacket, and he had managed without luxury items before. "Don't worry about it," he said finally. "Keep it as long as you need it. I know where to find you if I really need it back." Claire looked like she wanted to argue, but the bus was already approaching her stop, and other passengers were starting to crowd toward the door. "At least let me buy you a coffee sometime," she said. "To thank you properly." David smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in weeks. "I don't drink much coffee," he said. "But I appreciate the thought." She pressed a business card into his hand just before the bus doors opened. "In case you change your mind," she said, and then she was gone, stepping off into the bustling downtown morning wearing his jacket and carrying a piece of his story with her. David looked down at the business card as the bus pulled away from the curb. Claire Davidson, documentary filmmaker. It read, with a Los Angeles address and contact information that suggested she was more successful than her stranded circumstances had indicated. He had given his jacket to a filmmaker, someone whose job was to tell stories about people and places and moments that might otherwise go unnoticed. The rest of his workday passed in a blur of physical labor and constant cold. Without his jacket, David found himself shivering during breaks, grateful for the warehouse's inadequate heating system in a way that he had never been before. His coworkers noticed his lack of proper outerwear and offered him extra shirts, old sweatshirts that had been forgotten in lockers, anything that might help him stay warm during the long shift. "Where's your coat, Rodriguez?" asked Miguel Santos, the shift supervisor who had become something like a friend over the past 8 months. "You know better than to come to work without layers in this weather." "Had to lend it to someone who needed it more," David said, which was true but incomplete. He didn't mention the bus stop, or the stranger, or the way Claire's gratitude had made him feel useful in a way that his warehouse job rarely did. Miguel shook his head but didn't press for details. "You're too generous for your own good," he said. "But that's what makes you a good man." The comment stayed with David throughout the afternoon as he loaded trucks and organized inventory, as he performed the repetitive tasks that kept food on his table and a roof over Michael's head. He hadn't thought of himself as particularly generous, certainly not as a good man in any meaningful sense. He was just a father trying to survive, making decisions one day at a time based on circumstances he couldn't control. But maybe Miguel was right. Maybe there was something valuable in the choice to help when you had very little to give, in the willingness to share, even when sharing meant going without. David had grown up with stories about his grandmother, who had fed neighborhood children during the Depression, even when her own pantry was nearly empty, who had believed that kindness was a responsibility rather than a luxury. The bus ride home was longer and colder than usual, and by the time David reached his neighborhood, he was genuinely uncomfortable in a way that reminded him how much he had taken his jacket for granted. The wind seemed to cut through his flannel shirt like it was made of paper, and he found himself walking faster than usual, eager to reach the minimal warmth of his apartment. Michael was waiting for him when he got home, sitting at their small kitchen table working on homework with the focused concentration that had always been his strongest trait. The boy looked up when David walked in, and his face immediately showed concern. "Dad, where's your jacket?" Michael asked. "It's freezing out there." David sat down across from his son, trying not to let his teeth chatter. "I gave it to someone who needed it," he said. "A woman who was stranded at the bus stop without a coat." Michael considered this information with the seriousness that he brought to most adult conversations. At 9 years old, he had already learned more about necessity and sacrifice than most children his age, had watched his father make difficult choices, and had begun to understand that sometimes helping others meant accepting discomfort yourself. "Will she give it back?" Michael asked. "Maybe," David said. "But even if she doesn't, it's okay. It's just a coat." Michael nodded, but David could see that the boy understood the jacket's significance, remembered his mother buying it, knew that it was one of the few nice things they still owned from their previous life. "Mom would have liked that you helped someone," Michael said quietly. The observation hit David with unexpected force, confirming what he had felt at the bus stop but hadn't been able to articulate. Carmen would have been proud of his choice, would have made the same decision without hesitation. In some strange way, giving away her anniversary gift had been the most meaningful way to honor her memory that he had found since her death. "Yes," David said, reaching across the table to squeeze his son's hand. "She would have." That night, as David lay in bed listening to the wind rattle their inadequate windows, he thought about Claire Davidson and wondered what kind of documentaries she made, what stories she chose to tell. The business card was on his nightstand, and he had looked her up on his phone, finding a website that showcased films about social justice, economic inequality, and overlooked communities. Her work had been featured at film festivals, had won awards, had apparently made a difference in people's lives. He wondered if she had made it to her destination safely, if she was warm and comfortable in some downtown hotel, if she was already planning her return to California where winter was a theoretical concept rather than a daily survival challenge. The jacket would probably seem less significant to her by now, just another piece of clothing rather than a lifeline in a moment of crisis. But David found that he didn't regret his choice, even as he pulled every blanket in the apartment over himself and Michael, even as they fell asleep in the same bed, because it was the only way to stay warm enough to rest. The discomfort was temporary, but the knowledge that he had helped someone when it mattered would last much longer. 3 days later, Claire returned to the bus stop. David almost didn't recognize her at first. She was dressed appropriately for the weather now, wearing a proper winter coat and boots that were designed for ice and snow rather than California sidewalks. She was standing near the shelter, checking her watch and looking around with the patient expression of someone who had learned how public transportation worked in this part of the city. "Claire?" David said as he approached the bus stop. "What are you doing back here?" She turned at the sound of his name, and her face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire appearance. "David, I was hoping I'd find you here. I have something for you." She held out a large shopping bag, and when David peered inside, he saw his jacket, freshly dry-cleaned and folded carefully. But there was more. He could see other items beneath the coat, and when he looked at Claire questioningly, she gestured for him to look more thoroughly. Inside the bag was a new winter coat, clearly expensive, still bearing tags that showed a price that was more than David made in a month. There were also thick gloves, a warm hat, and a scarf that looked like it could withstand an Arctic expedition. Everything was in his size, carefully selected and clearly chosen with attention to both function and quality. "Claire, I can't accept this," David said, though his body was already responding to the sight of warm clothing, already imagining how it would feel to be properly protected against the cold. "This is too much." "It's not nearly enough," Claire said firmly. "What you did for me, giving me your jacket when you clearly needed it yourself, that was extraordinary. This is just returning the favor." David looked around the bus stop, acutely aware that they were attracting attention from other commuters who were beginning to arrive for the morning buses. The exchange felt too public, too dramatic for the simple act of kindness that had prompted it. "How did you know I'd be here?" he asked. "I didn't," Claire admitted. "I've been coming back for 3 days, hoping to catch you. I asked around the neighborhood, and people said you were a regular on this route. I wanted to return your jacket and thank you properly." David pulled his original coat from the bag, feeling the familiar weight of it in his hands. It smelled like professional cleaning products now, rather than Carmen's perfume, but it was still the same jacket, still carrying the same memories. He put it on immediately, and the warmth was like an embrace from someone he had missed desperately. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it more deeply than the simple words could convey. "But I really can't keep the other things. They're too expensive." Claire's expression became more serious, and she stepped closer to him, lowering her voice so that their conversation became more private despite the public setting. "David, can I tell you why I was in your neighborhood that morning? What I was doing there?" David nodded, curious despite himself. "I'm making a documentary about economic inequality in American cities," Claire said. "I was visiting community organizations, interviewing people about their experiences, trying to understand how economic segregation affects daily life. My rental car broke down, and I was completely unprepared for the reality of getting around without reliable transportation." She paused, looking out at the street where their bus would soon appear. "What you did for me wasn't just personal kindness, though it was certainly that. It was also a perfect example of the kind of community support that exists in neighborhoods that the rest of the city has written off. You had very little, but you shared what you had with someone who needed it." David felt uncomfortable with the analysis, with the way Claire was transforming his simple gesture into something larger and more significant. "I just saw someone who was cold," he said. "Anyone would have done the print. Same thing." "No," Claire said quietly. "Anyone wouldn't have. And that's what makes your story important." The bus appeared in the distance, and David realized that their conversation was about to be interrupted by the demands of his workday schedule. But Claire seemed to sense the urgency as well, and she spoke quickly. "I'd like to interview you," she said, "for the documentary. Your perspective, your experiences, the way you navigate daily challenges with such grace and generosity. I think your voice could help people understand something important about community and resilience." David's first instinct was to decline. He didn't consider himself particularly articulate, didn't think his story was interesting enough for a documentary, didn't want to become the object of pity or charity. But there was something in Claire's expression that suggested she saw him differently than he saw himself, that she found value in experiences he had learned to consider ordinary. "I don't know," he said as the bus pulled up to the stop. "I'm not good at talking about myself." "Think about it," Claire said, handing him another business card. "And please, keep the coat and gloves. Consider them a loan, if that makes you more comfortable, but don't freeze because of pride." As they boarded the bus together, David found himself sitting next to Claire for the second time, but now their dynamic was completely different. She was no longer a stranger in distress, and he was no longer just a helpful commuter. They were potential collaborators in something larger, connected by a moment of kindness that had revealed something meaningful about both of their characters. During the ride downtown, Claire told him more about her documentary project, about the communities she had visited, and the stories she had heard. She talked about economic policies that had created the conditions he lived with every day, about systemic issues that made individual kindness both more necessary and more remarkable. "People in comfortable circumstances often think that poverty makes people selfish," she said. "But what I found is exactly the opposite. The communities with the least resources are often the most generous, the most willing to share what they have." David listened to her analysis while watching the familiar neighborhoods pass outside the bus windows. He had never thought about his daily experiences in terms of larger social patterns, had never considered that his struggles and his responses to them might be representative of something beyond his individual circumstances. When they reached downtown, Claire stood up to leave, but before she did, she turned back to David one more time. "Will you think about the interview?" she asked. "I really believe your perspective could make a difference." David nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. "I'll think about it." he said. That evening, after Michael had gone to bed, David sat at their small kitchen table and called the number on Claire's business card. When she answered, her voice was warm and immediately recognizable. David, she said. I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about what you said, David told her. About the documentary. I'm still not sure I'm the right person for what you're trying to do, but I'm willing to talk. That's all I'm asking for, Claire said. Just a conversation. If you're not comfortable with anything, we stop. No pressure, no expectations beyond what you're willing to share. They arranged to meet the following Saturday at a coffee shop in David's neighborhood, a place he had walked past hundreds of times, but never entered because coffee shop prices weren't compatible with his carefully managed budget. Claire insisted on paying, insisted that this was a business meeting and therefore her responsibility. The coffee shop turned out to be warmer and more welcoming than David had expected, with mismatched furniture and local artwork on the walls, and the kind of casual atmosphere that made conversation feel natural rather than forced. Claire arrived with a small digital recorder and a notebook, but she kept both devices in her bag while they talked, focusing entirely on David's words and expressions. Tell me about your neighborhood, she said. What's it like to live there, to raise a child there? David started slowly, describing the practical challenges of limited transportation and expensive groceries, the way economic isolation affected everything from school options to healthcare access. But as Claire asked thoughtful questions and listened with genuine interest, he found himself opening up about more personal experiences. He talked about the sense of community that existed among people who shared similar struggles, the way neighbors looked out for each other's children and shared resources when times were particularly hard. He described the small business owners who extended credit when money was tight, the teachers who went beyond their job descriptions to support students from challenging circumstances. There's a lot of kindness in my neighborhood, David said. People who don't have much, but who share what they have. It's not always visible to outsiders, but it's there. Claire nodded, taking notes now, capturing specific phrases and observations that seemed particularly meaningful. That's exactly what I'm trying to document, she said. The human connections that persist despite economic hardship, the way communities take care of themselves when larger institutions fail them. As their conversation continued, David began to understand what Claire was hoping to achieve with her documentary. She wasn't looking for poverty tourism or inspiration porn, wasn't trying to make comfortable people feel better about inequality by highlighting individual resilience. She was trying to show the complexity and dignity of communities that were often portrayed only in terms of their deficits. Would you be willing to let me film some of your daily routine? Claire asked. Nothing intrusive, just ordinary moments that show what life is like in your neighborhood. Your commute, maybe time with your son, interactions with neighbors and coworkers. David hesitated. The idea of cameras following him around felt overwhelming, and he worried about how his participation might affect Michael, who was already dealing with enough challenges without becoming the grass subject of a film project. What about my son? He asked. I don't want him to become part of this if it's going to cause problems for him. We would be very careful about Michael's privacy, Claire assured him. Any footage involving him would require your explicit consent, and we'd avoid anything that might make him uncomfortable at school or with his friends. The focus would be on you and your experiences as an adult navigating economic challenges. David agreed to a trial period, a few days of filming that would help him understand what his participation would involve. Claire arranged for a small crew, just herself and a camera operator, and they began documenting his daily routine with the kind of respectful distance that suggested experience with sensitive subjects. The filming process was less intrusive than David had expected. Claire and her camera operator, a quiet man named Rob, who had worked on several social justice documentaries, stayed in the background during David's commute and work shifts, capturing the texture of his daily life without interfering with its rhythm. What surprised David most was how the presence of cameras changed other people's reactions to him. Co-workers who had barely acknowledged him before became interested in sharing their own stories. Neighbors approached him with curiosity about the film project, and even strangers on the bus seemed more willing to engage in conversation. People want their stories to be heard, Claire observed after a day of filming in David's neighborhood. When they see that someone is paying attention, really listening to their experiences, they open up in ways that are remarkable. The documentary project expanded beyond David's individual story, as Claire connected with other community members who were willing to share their experiences. She interviewed Miguel Santos about the challenges of managing a warehouse staff in an economy where job security was constantly threatened. She talked to Mrs. Patterson, David's elderly neighbor, about the way gentrification was slowly displacing longtime residents. She captured conversations at the local community center, where volunteers provided services that government agencies couldn't or wouldn't offer. Throughout the filming process, David found himself seeing his own neighborhood through different eyes. Claire's questions prompted him to think about experiences he had taken for granted, to articulate feelings and observations that he had never put into words before. The documentary was teaching him about his own life in ways that surprised him. The moment that became the emotional center of the film happened 3 weeks into the filming process, when Claire accompanied David on his morning commute and witnessed an interaction that perfectly captured the themes she was exploring. An elderly man at the bus stop was having trouble with his medication, confused about dosages and timing, clearly struggling with cognitive issues that were affecting his ability to manage his health independently. David recognized the man as a regular commuter who had been riding the same bus route for years, and without hesitation, he sat down next to him and began helping him organize his pills and understand his prescription instructions. The conversation was gentle and patient, with David treating the older man's confusion with dignity rather than condescension, offering practical help without making him feel diminished. Claire's camera captured the entire interaction, including the relief on the elderly man's face, and the matter-of-fact way that David transitioned back to his normal morning routine once the problem was solved. It was the kind of everyday kindness that happened constantly in communities like David's, but rarely received attention from outsiders. "That's it," Claire said quietly to Rob as they watched David help the older man onto the bus. "That's the story I've been trying to tell." The documentary took shape over the following months, as Claire wove together individual stories into a larger narrative about community resilience, economic inequality, and the human connections that persist despite systemic challenges. David's jacket story became the opening sequence, establishing themes of unexpected kindness and cross-class interaction that resonated throughout the film. Claire spent hours with David reviewing footage and discussing the film's direction, ensuring that his story was being told in a way that felt authentic to his experience. She showed him early cuts of scenes involving him and Michael, giving him veto power over anything that made him uncomfortable or that he felt misrepresented their family's reality. "This isn't just my film anymore," Claire told David during one of their editing sessions. "It's our film. Your voice, your community's voice, needs to be authentic and strong." The editing process took nearly 6 months, with Claire traveling back and forth between Los Angeles and Chicago to ensure that every detail was accurate and respectful. She hired local editors who understood the cultural nuances of the neighborhoods she was documenting, and she established a community advisory board that included David, Miguel, Mrs. Patterson, and other residents who could provide feedback on the film's representation of their experiences. David found himself becoming not just a subject, but a collaborator, helping Claire understand context that might not be obvious to outsiders, and suggesting connections between individual stories that revealed larger patterns about economic resilience and community support. His insights shaped the film's narrative structure in ways that made it more authentic and emotionally compelling. The documentary, titled Hidden Kindness: Stories from America's Forgotten Communities, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January, exactly 11 months after David had given his jacket to a stranger at a Chicago bus stop. Claire invited David and Michael to attend the premiere, covering their travel expenses and arranging for them to stay in a hotel that was nicer than any place they had ever experienced. The festival screening was David's first time seeing the completed documentary, and watching his own story unfold on a big screen in front of hundreds of film industry professionals was surreal and overwhelming. The opening sequence showed him giving Claire his jacket in real time, recreated through careful editing of security camera footage that Claire had obtained from the city's transportation authority. But what moved David most was seeing how his individual act of kindness had been woven into a larger tapestry of community stories that revealed the dignity, complexity, and mutual support that characterized neighborhoods like his. The film didn't romanticize poverty or present simplistic solutions to systemic problems, but it did show the human connections that made survival possible, and sometimes even joyful. The audience response was immediate and emotional. During the question and answer session following the screening, several viewers wiped away tears as they thanked Claire and David for sharing stories that challenged their assumptions about economic inequality and community resilience. Film distributors approached Claire before she left the theater, competing for the rights to bring the documentary to mainstream audiences. "I've never seen anything quite like this," said Sarah Chen, a documentary distributor who had worked with Academy Award-winning films. "You've captured something essential about American community life that rarely gets this kind of thoughtful treatment. This film is going to change conversations about poverty and kindness." The Sundance premiere was followed by screenings at film festivals across the country, each one generating media attention and critical acclaim that exceeded Claire's most optimistic expectations. Hidden Kindness received reviews that praised its nuanced portrayal of economic challenges and its celebration of human decency in difficult circumstances. But more importantly for David, the film began attracting the attention of organizations and individuals who wanted to provide concrete support for the communities it portrayed. A nonprofit foundation in New York committed to funding after-school programs in David's neighborhood after seeing how the documentary illustrated the lack of resources available to working parents. A healthcare organization in California established a mobile clinic program for underserved communities, inspired by scenes in the documentary that showed residents struggling to access basic medical care. A technology company created a scholarship fund for children from the neighborhoods featured in the film, recognizing the educational challenges that limited opportunities for advancement. The most significant response came from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb, a venture capitalist who had grown up in circumstances similar to David's but had built a fortune in tech investments, reached out to Claire after seeing the film at a Los Angeles screening. He wanted to do more than write a check. He wanted to create sustainable change in communities like the ones portrayed in the documentary. "I see myself in David's story," Marcus told Claire during their first meeting. "I had teachers and neighbors and strangers who helped me when I needed it most, and I want to create systematic ways to support that kind of community resilience." Marcus proposed establishing the Hidden Kindness Foundation, a nonprofit organization that would provide direct support to individuals and families featured in the documentary, while also funding community programs that strengthened the social networks that made survival possible in economically challenging circumstances. The Foundation's first initiative was an emergency assistance fund that provided immediate help to families facing crisis situations, like job loss, medical emergencies, or housing instability. But Marcus also wanted to create longer-term programs that addressed systemic issues rather than just individual needs. Working with David as a community liaison, the foundation developed job training programs that connected neighborhood residents with employment opportunities in growing industries. They established microloan programs that helped small business owners expand their operations and hire local workers. They funded childcare facilities that made it possible for single parents to pursue education or job training. David found himself in the unprecedented position of helping to direct the allocation of resources to his own community. The foundation hired him as a full-time community coordinator, a position that paid more than his warehouse job and allowed him to use his deep knowledge of neighborhood needs to guide program development. "I never imagined that giving someone my coat would lead to this," David told Claire, as they walked through his neighborhood 6 months after the documentary's premiere. "Everything feels different now. Not just for me, but for everyone here." The changes were visible throughout the community. The corner store where David bought groceries had expanded its fresh produce section with help from Foundation microloans. The community center had new programs for seniors and working parents. The elementary school Michael attended had received funding for arts and athletics programs that had been cut during budget crises. But perhaps most importantly, the documentary had changed how outsiders perceived the neighborhood. Visitors arrived regularly, not as tourists seeking to observe poverty, but as potential partners looking to support existing community strengths. University students came to volunteer with foundation programs. Local churches and civic organizations initiated partnership projects. City officials began paying attention to infrastructure needs that had been ignored for years. Michael's life had been transformed along with his father's. The foundation had established a scholarship fund that would cover his college tuition, and he was already showing interest in filmmaking and community organizing, inspired by watching his father's story reach audiences around the world. "Dad," Michael said one evening as they sat in their new apartment, a larger space in the same neighborhood that the foundation had helped them afford, "do you think Mom would be proud of what happened?" David considered the question seriously, thinking about Carmen's values and her belief in the power of individual kindness to create larger changes. "I think she'd be amazed," he said finally, but not surprised. She always believed that good things came from helping other people. The documentary continued to generate attention and awards throughout the year. It received an Academy Award nomination for Best Documentary Feature, an honor that brought David and Claire to the Oscars ceremony in Los Angeles. Although they didn't win, the nomination generated additional media coverage that expanded the film's reach and the foundation's support base. Television interviews, newspaper profiles, and magazine articles told David's story to audiences that might never have seen the documentary itself. Each interview was an opportunity to highlight not just his individual experience, but the broader community needs that the foundation was working to address. "The important thing isn't that I gave someone my jacket," David said during a television interview that was broadcast nationally. "The important thing is that there are people in every community who are willing to help each other, and we need to support the conditions that make that kindness possible." The foundation's work expanded beyond David's original neighborhood as other communities requested similar support. Using the documentary's impact as a model, Claire and Marcus developed a replication strategy that combines storytelling with direct service provision and community development funding. They identified communities with strong social networks but limited economic resources, worked with local residents to understand specific needs and existing assets, and then developed customized programs that built on community strengths rather than imposing external solutions. Each new community partnership included a media component that told local stories with the same respect and nuance that had made Hidden Kindness successful. The goal was to change narratives about poverty and community resilience while providing concrete resources that improved daily life for residents. 2 years after the documentary's premiere, the Hidden Kindness Foundation was operating in 15 cities across the United States, serving over 10,000 families through emergency assistance, job training, small business support, and community development programs. The foundation had leveraged the documentary's success into sustained funding from corporations, private donors, and government agencies that recognized the effectiveness of community-centered approaches to pressures. Addressing economic inequality. David had become a nationally recognized advocate for community-based solutions to poverty, speaking at conferences and universities about the importance of listening to people who were actually experiencing economic challenges rather than assuming that outsiders knew what communities needed. "The expertise already exists in every neighborhood," he told audiences of social workers, policymakers, and nonprofit leaders. "Our job isn't to bring solutions to communities, it's to support the solutions that communities are already creating." His speaking engagements took him across the country, but he always returned to Chicago, to the neighborhood where his transformation had begun. The foundation had purchased a building there that served as both community center and national headquarters, a space where local programs operated alongside strategic planning for national expansion. The original bus stop where David had met Claire had been renovated with foundation funding, transformed from a minimal shelter into a proper waiting area with heating, lighting, and real-time arrival information. A small plaque commemorated the moment that had sparked everything that followed, though David had insisted that the plaque focus on community kindness rather than individual recognition. Claire continued to document the foundation's work and its impact on participating communities. Her follow-up film, Hidden Kindness, 5 years later, showed how the original documentary had catalyzed sustained change rather than just temporary attention. The follow-up film included interviews with dozens of people whose lives had been affected by foundation programs. From small business owners who had expanded their operations with microloan support, to young adults who had pursued college educations with scholarship assistance, to families who had stabilized their housing situations with emergency aid. But it also showed how the communities themselves had evolved, becoming more connected to outside resources while maintaining the internal networks that had always been their greatest strength. The Foundation's approach had strengthened rather than replaced existing community support systems. Michael, now a teenager, appeared in the follow-up film as someone who had grown up witnessing his father's transformation from struggling single parent to community leader. His perspective provided insight into how children experienced economic instability and community resilience. "I remember when we were really poor," Michael said during his interview. "But I also remember that there were always people who helped us, who made sure we had what we needed. The foundation just made it possible for more people to help more families." The success of both documentaries established Claire as a leading filmmaker in the social justice space, but she continued to center community voices in her work, rather than positioning herself as the primary narrator of other people's experiences. Her production company, which she had named Hidden Kindness Media in honor of the project that had defined her career, focused exclusively on stories about community resilience and mutual aid. Each film was developed in partnership with the communities being portrayed, with local residents serving as co-producers and sharing in any profits generated by the work. The business model was unusual in the entertainment industry, but it proved sustainable and replicable. Other filmmakers began adopting similar approaches, creating a new genre of community-partnered documentaries that prioritized authentic representation over external interpretation. David's role continued to evolve as the Foundation's work expanded. He had become its executive director, overseeing a staff of community coordinators who worked in cities across the country. His lack of formal credentials in nonprofit management or social work had initially concerned some board members, but his deep understanding of community needs and his ability to build trust with residents had proved more valuable than traditional training. The Foundation developed its own leadership development program, training community members to become program coordinators and policy advocates in their own neighborhoods. The approach ensured that expansion efforts were led by people who understood local contexts rather than outsiders who brought good intentions but limited cultural knowledge. As the Foundation approached its 5th anniversary, David often found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a cold morning. The transformation of his personal circumstances had been remarkable, but the broader impact on communities across the country felt almost miraculous. The numbers were impressive. The Foundation had provided emergency assistance to over 25,000 families, helped launch 500 small businesses, and funded college educations for 200 young adults. More than 50 community centers had received program funding, and dozens of neighborhoods had seen infrastructure improvements as a result of advocacy efforts supported by Foundation resources. But beyond the statistics, David was most proud of the cultural shift that had occurred in how people talked about poverty and community support. The documentaries and Foundation work had contributed to broader conversations about economic inequality that focused on systemic solutions rather than individual charity. Policymakers had begun citing the Foundation's community-centered approach in discussions about social safety net programs. Academic researchers studied its methods as examples of effective community development. Other nonprofit organizations adopted similar strategies that prioritized local leadership and long-term relationship building over short-term service delivery. The winter morning when David had given his jacket to a stranger felt both recent and ancient, a moment that had divided his life into before and after in ways he was still discovering. The simple choice to help someone in need had revealed connections and possibilities that he never could have imagined, transforming not just his own circumstances, but the entire trajectory of his family's future. Standing at the same bus stop 5 years later, now wearing a warm coat that he had purchased himself with money earned through work that felt meaningful and sustainable, David could see children playing in a pocket park that had been created with Foundation funding. Their laughter echoed off the walls of buildings that had been renovated through community development programs, and their parents gathered in spaces that had been designed to strengthen neighborhood connections. The bus that pulled up to the stop was newer and cleaner than the one he had ridden during his warehouse days, part of a transportation improvement initiative that the foundation had successfully advocated for with city officials. The passengers who boarded included people he recognized from the neighborhood, but also others who were visiting for community programs or business meetings, evidence of the increased investment and attention that had followed the documentary's success. As David rode toward the foundation's headquarters, where he would spend the day reviewing proposals for new community partnerships and planning the next phase of national expansion, he thought about the circular nature of kindness and how individual actions could create ripple effects that extended far beyond their original intent. The jacket he had given to Claire that February morning had been returned to him months later, professionally cleaned and carefully preserved. But he rarely wore it anymore, preferring the new coat that represented his transformed circumstances rather than his previous struggles. The original jacket hung in his closet as a reminder of the moment when his life had changed direction, a tangible symbol of the power of unexpected generosity. Michael, now 15 and already showing leadership skills that reminded David of Carmen's confidence and compassion, had begun volunteering with foundation programs, working with younger children in after-school programs, and helping elderly residents navigate social services. The values that David and Carmen had tried to instill in their son were manifesting in ways that suggested the next generation would continue the work of building stronger, more connected communities. "Dad," Michael had said recently, "I want to make documentaries like Claire when I grow up, but I want to tell stories about kids who are making a difference in their neighborhoods." The comment had filled David with pride and hope, suggesting that the foundation's work would continue beyond his own involvement, carried forward by young people who had grown up witnessing the power of community, organizing, and mutual support. As the bus approached downtown, David could see the city's skyline that had once seemed distant and inaccessible from his old neighborhood. Now he traveled regularly between the foundation's community programs and its downtown offices, between grassroots organizing and policy advocacy, between the local and the national implications of community-centered social change. The transformation had been remarkable, but David understood that it had been built on principles that had always existed in his neighborhood. Values of mutual aid and shared responsibility that had sustained families through generations of economic hardship. The foundation hadn't created those values. It had simply provided resources that allowed them to flourish and expand their impact. The bus reached David's stop, and he stepped off into the busy downtown morning, surrounded by people hurrying to jobs and appointments that shaped the economic and political systems that affected communities across the country. But now he was part of those systems in a way that allowed him to influence them, to advocate for policies and programs that supported the kind of community resilience he had experienced firsthand. Walking toward the foundation's offices, David passed the coffee shop where he and Claire had first discussed the documentary project that had changed everything. The conversation that had begun there had grown into a movement that was now touching thousands of lives annually, proving that authentic storytelling combined with concrete support could create sustainable social change. The foundation's building buzzed with activity as staff members prepared for another day of community partnership work. Program coordinators called in reports from cities across the country, sharing stories of families who had achieved housing stability, young adults who had started businesses, children who were thriving in expanded BA educational programs. Each story was unique, but they all reflected the same fundamental truth that David had learned from his own experience. When communities had the resources they needed to support their existing networks of mutual aid and shared responsibility, remarkable transformations became possible. Individual kindness, supported by systematic change, could indeed create the conditions for widespread human flourishing. As David settled into his office to begin another day of work that felt both challenging and deeply meaningful, he thought about the millions of people across the country who were facing circumstances similar to his own, quote, 5 years earlier. His story had become public, but their stories remained largely invisible, their daily acts of kindness and community support unrecognized by mainstream media and policy discussions. The Foundation's work was expanding their capacity to document and support those hidden networks of community resilience, to amplify voices that deserve to be heard, and to create conditions where individual generosity could flourish into systematic social change. The morning sun streamed through David's office windows, illuminating photos on his desk that showed Michael at various stages of his childhood, Claire at documentary premieres and community events, and neighbors from the old and new versions of his community gathered for Foundation celebrations and program launches. Each photo represented connections that had begun with a simple decision to help someone in need, relationships that had grown into a network of mutual support that now spanned the entire country. The transformation had been remarkable, but it had also been logical, the natural result of treating people with dignity and respect while providing them with the resources they needed to build on their existing strengths. As David opened his laptop to begin another day of community organizing and social change work, he reflected on the circular nature of kindness and the way that individual actions could create ripple effects that extended far beyond their original intent. The jacket he had given to a stranger on a cold morning had been returned to him, multiplied, transformed into opportunities and resources that had changed not just his own life, but the lives of thousands of people across the country. The work continued, community by community, family by family, one act of kindness at a time, building toward a future where economic hardship no longer prevented people from accessing the dignity, opportunity, and mutual support that every human being deserved. David's story had become part of that larger narrative, proof that transformation was possible when individual compassion connected with systematic change to create conditions where hidden kindness could flourish into visible, sustainable social progress.